New York Harbor, June 1943. The transport ship SS Mariposa cut through morning fog so thick it felt solid, carrying 300 German prisoners across water that shimmered like molten steel. Below deck, Corporal Werner Krauss pressed his face against a porthole no bigger than his fist, watching gray shadows emerge from the mist. He had been told America was burning, told its cities lay in ruins, its people starving, its military collapsing under the weight of a war it could never win. The propaganda films had shown empty streets and desperate faces. But through that small circle of salt-stained glass, something impossible rose from the fog, something that made Werner's breath stop in his throat. The crossing had taken 11 days. 11 days in the belly of a converted luxury liner, where bunks stacked 3 high replaced mahogany paneling, where the smell of diesel fuel mixed with unwashed bodies and fear. The ship rolled with every wave, and men who had survived artillery barrages and tank assaults found themselves defeated by simple seasickness, vomiting into buckets until there was nothing left but bile and shame. Werner had been captured in Tunisia on a morning that started like any other. His battalion had been holding a position in the rocky hills west of Kazarang Pass, dug in behind sandbags and prayer. They'd watched the British tanks approach across the valley floor, kicking up dust that hung in the air like smoke. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. And numbers lost meaning after a while. Their own panzers had run out of fuel 2 days earlier, abandoned in wadis like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts. The surrender itself had been almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. British officers speaking careful German, offering cigarettes, explaining the process with the tired professionalism of men who'd accepted thousands of surrenders before. Field rations that tasted better than anything they'd eaten in months. Chocolate, real coffee. Tinned peaches that Werner ate slowly, trying to make them last, unable to remember the last time he tasted something sweet. Then came the long truck convoy to the coast, bouncing over roads that barely deserved the name, past burned-out vehicles and abandoned equipment. The waiting in transit camps where dust turned everything the color of old bones, where men sat in the shade of canvas tents and tried not to think about what came next. Letters home, carefully worded to pass censors. Long days of nothing punctuated by moments of administrative processing. Names, serial numbers, medical checks. The machinery of war working in reverse, sorting captured men like grain from chaff. And finally the ship, the SS Mariposa, once a luxury cruise liner that carried wealthy Americans to exotic ports, now converted to haul prisoners across an ocean most of them had never seen. Werner had grown up in a village where the farthest anyone traveled was to Stuttgart for market day. The sea was something from storybooks. The Atlantic was a vast, rolling emptiness that made him feel small in ways the desert never had. Most of the men stayed below deck during the crossing. Seasickness, shame, the crushing weight of what surrender meant. But Werner couldn't stay away from that porthole. He was 22 years old, had never been more than 100 kilometers from his village near Stuttgart, had joined the Wehrmacht because everyone did, because the alternative was unthinkable. His father had fought in the Great War, had come home with lungs scarred by mustard gas, and stories about American soldiers sharing chocolate and cigarettes. Werner hadn't believed those stories. Propaganda, his officers said. Weakness disguised as kindness. The fog began to lift as dawn broke over the Atlantic. Light spread across the water like spilled honey, turning the gray to gold, and that's when Werner saw them. Buildings. But not buildings like anything he had ever imagined. They rose from the southern tip of Manhattan like steel mountains, their peaks lost in clouds, their facades catching the morning sun and throwing it back in shards of brilliant light. The Empire State Building stood tallest, a spire of limestone and steel that seemed to pierce the sky itself, 102 stories of impossible vertical ambition. Around it, the Chrysler Building's Art Deco crown gleamed like polished silver, its triangular windows arranged in patterns that caught the light and made the entire structure appear to glow from within. The Woolworth Building's Gothic towers reached upward with the intensity of cathedral spires, terracotta decoration creating shadows and depth that made the building seem alive. Dozens more surrounded them, a forest of concrete and glass and steel that defied every law of engineering Werner had been taught. The Equitable Building, the city's service building, the Bank of Manhattan Trust Building, each one impossibly tall, impossibly solid, impossibly real. He stepped back from the porthole. His hands were shaking. His breath came short and shallow, as if the air itself had changed. Back home in Stuttgart, the tallest building was the church steeple, maybe 30 meters high, visible from anywhere in the village. These structures were 10 times that height. 20 times. More. They shouldn't exist. The engineering alone should make them impossible. The weight of all that stone and steel should crush itself, should sink into the earth, should collapse under its own ambition. But there they stood, solid, real, absolutely undeniable. "Dietrich," he whispered to the man in the bunk beside him. His voice cracked. "Come look at this." Dietrich Hoffmann had been a teacher before the regime called into service. Mathematics and physics at a gymnasium in Hamburg. He believed in numbers, in logic, in what could be proven and measured. He'd spent his entire adult life teaching students about structural limits, about load-bearing capacities, about the fundamental laws that governed what was possible and what was fantasy. He shuffled to the porthole in his stained undershirt, feet bare on the metal deck, and pressed his eye against the glass. His body went rigid, completely still, like he'd been turned to stone himself. One hand came up slowly, pressed against the bulkhead beside the porthole, as if he needed to steady himself. His breathing changed. Werner could hear it, quick and shallow, the breath of a man whose entire understanding of reality was being rewritten. The silence stretched. Seconds became minutes. Other prisoners noticed, began crowding around, pushing and jostling for position, taking turns at the tiny window. Some gasped. Some swore. Some simply stared, their faces blank with incomprehension. The only sound was the thrum of the ship's engines and the splash of waves against the hull, steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat. "It's a trick," someone finally said. Otto Becker, a sergeant from Dresden, who still wore his Iron Cross even in captivity, polishing it every morning with a corner of his blanket. Painted canvas. Hollywood magic. They're good at that, the Americans. Movies. Illusions. They want us to think they're strong. They want us to believe the propaganda. But Werner was already shaking his head, unable to tear his eyes away from what he was seeing. The way the light hit those buildings, the way shadows fell across the harbor waters in perfect geometric patterns, the way the structures seemed to have weight and presence and solidity. You couldn't fake that. You couldn't paint that on canvas and make it look so absolutely, undeniably real. Light didn't reflect off painted canvas the way it reflected off those glass windows. Shadows didn't fall with that kind of precision unless they were cast by real, solid objects of immense size. "Those are buildings," Dietrich said softly. His voice carried the weight of someone whose entire understanding of the world had just shifted beneath his feet. "Real buildings. I've studied engineering for 20 years. I know structural limits. I know what's possible with steel and concrete. I've taught students the mathematics of compression and tension and load distribution." He paused, his hand still pressed against the bulkhead. "Those buildings should be impossible. But they're not. They're there. Which means—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone crowded around that porthole understood what he meant. If those buildings were real, then everything else might be real too. The stories about American industrial capacity, the numbers they'd heard about factory production, the claims about endless resources and bottomless manpower, all of it suddenly, terrifyingly plausible. The ship moved closer. The engines changed pitch, slowing, maneuvering through harbor traffic that seemed impossible in its density. Cargo ships, military vessels, tugboats, ferries, all moving with practiced coordination through waters that sparkled in the morning sun. And with each passing minute, details emerged from the morning haze that made the unreality of it all somehow more real. Windows, thousands upon thousands of windows, tiny rectangles of glass that caught the sun and winked like distant stars, each one representing a room, an office, a space where people worked and lived and went about their business 30, 40, 50 stories above the street. Werner tried to count them on just one building and gave up after 100. There were too many. The sheer scale defeated comprehension. The streets below were canyons of shadow, rivers of movement that even from this distance suggested crowds and traffic and a city fully, vibrantly alive, not burning, not starving, not defeated. Cars moved in orderly lines. Pedestrians crowded sidewalks. Smoke rose from chimneys and vents, the breath of a city at work. Everything suggested functionality, prosperity, normalcy. The kind of normalcy that felt impossible during wartime. Werner had been raised on newsreels. Every week, before the feature film at the cinema in Stuttgart, they'd shown footage of the war. Triumphant German armies marching through conquered cities. Enemy nations crumbling under the weight of superior strategy. And always, always, images of America suffering. Cities under attack. Factories destroyed by submarine warfare. Bread lines stretching for blocks. Desperate faces. A nation buckling under the pressure of fighting wars on two fronts, unable to match the military might of the regime. But here was New York, its harbor filled with ships that moved with casual confidence. Its skyline untouched, unmarked, showing no signs of any attack or damage. Its buildings so tall they made medieval castles look like children's toys. So numerous they filled the entire southern tip of Manhattan like a forest of steel and stone. They told us we were winning, someone whispered behind Werner. Klaus Richter, a private from Berlin who joined up at 17, still believed every word his officers said. Until now. They said America was collapsing. They said their factories were rubble. They said, his voice trailed off. There was nothing more to say. The evidence before them spoke louder than any propaganda film, any officer's briefing, any newspaper headline. This was America, and it was winning. The guards noticed the commotion. American MPs in crisp uniforms, helmets painted white, their leather belts polished to a high shine, carbines slung across their backs with the casual confidence of men who had never questioned whether they would lose. They moved through the crowded hold with easy authority, not aggressive, but absolutely certain of their control. One of them, a sergeant with a Brooklyn accent thick as molasses and a face like weathered stone, walked to the porthole and looked out at what the prisoners were seeing. He stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, studying the skyline as if seeing it fresh through their eyes. Then he turned back to the crowd of German prisoners, all of them still staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something that might have been the beginning of despair. First time seeing the city? He asked. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, as if they were tourists on a pleasure cruise rather than prisoners of war crossing an ocean to an uncertain fate. No one answered. The question felt absurd. Of course, it was their first time. Most of them had never left Europe. The farthest Werner had traveled before the military was a school trip to Munich when he was 14. These men were farmers' sons, and shopkeepers' sons, and factory workers' sons. Their officers had shown them maps where America was a distant, weak nation playing at war, separated from reality by an ocean so vast it might as well have been another world. A nation of movie stars and gangsters, soft and decadent, and fundamentally unserious, certain to crumble when faced with German military discipline and superior willpower. The sergeant lit a cigarette, a lucky strike that he tapped twice against the pack before placing between his lips. The flame from his Zippo lighter flickered in the dim hold. He took a long drag, exhaled slowly, and smiled. Not cruel, not mocking. Something almost gentle, the way you might smile at children who just learned the truth about something they believed with absolute certainty. Empire State Building's 102 stories, he said conversationally, pointing with a cigarette. Tallest building in the world. Built during the Depression, when everyone said we were finished, when bread lines went around the block and men jumped from windows because they'd lost everything. We built it anyway. Took 1 year and 45 days from first steel to finished spire. 410 days. We built it while you folks were rebuilding your military, while your leaders were making promises about destiny and Lebensraum. He took another drag, let the smoke curl around his words. We used 60,000 tons of steel, 10 million bricks, 7 million man-hours. 5 workers died during construction. May they rest in peace. And when we finished, we had the tallest building in the world. Still do. He pointed at another building, the distinctive Art Deco crown, visible even through the morning haze. That's the Chrysler, 77 floors. Built in 1930. That one there, the Woolworth, 57 stories. Built in 1913, before most of you boys were born. We call it the Cathedral of Commerce. Cost over $13 million, and that was in 1913 money. He smiled again, that same gentle, almost sad smile. We've been building tall for a long time, boys. It's what we do when we're not fighting wars. Hell, sometimes we do it while fighting wars. Werner did the math in his head, a habit from his school days that he'd never quite lost. The Empire State Building was 102 stories tall. If each story was maybe 3 or 4 meters, that meant the building was over 300 meters high. Maybe more. His entire village in Stuttgart fit inside a valley between 2 hills. The church steeple was the tallest structure for 50 kilometers in any direction, barely 30 meters high. He'd climbed it once as a boy, made it to the bell tower, and looked out over the village and thought he was seeing the whole world. These buildings were 10 times taller, 20 times. They were taller than mountains. They were taller than clouds. How? Dietrich asked. His voice was barely audible over the engine noise, rough with emotion he was trying to suppress. How is it possible? The weight alone should. The stress on the foundation. The wind loads at that height. The sergeant shrugged, a gesture that somehow encompassed the entire impossible reality of what they were looking at. Steel frame construction, reinforced concrete, engineering, innovation, money, will. Take your pick. He flicked ash from his cigarette, watched it fall to the deck. We're good at building things, boys. Always have been. It's in our nature. Give an American a problem, and he'll figure out a way to solve it, usually by building something bigger than anyone thought possible. He paused, his smile fading into something more serious. And right now, we're building the biggest military machine the world has ever seen. Ships, planes, tanks, artillery, faster than you can destroy them. In factories that run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, staffed by workers who know exactly what they're building and why. He took another drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly. You boys are about to see a lot that might surprise you. And I'll tell you right now, honestly, because I think you deserve to hear it straight. This war's been over for a while. Your side just hasn't admitted it. The ship moved past the Statue of Liberty, and Werner pressed his face back against the porthole to watch her pass. He'd seen pictures in school, before the regime changed the textbooks and rewrote history to match their vision of the world. A gift from France, his teacher had said, her voice warm with the kind of pride people take in beautiful things. A symbol of freedom and democracy, she'd explained, showing them photographs of the statue on a day when storm clouds gathered behind her and made her torch seem to glow against the darkness. Later, different teachers with different textbooks had called it a monument to weakness, to the soft idealism that made democracies vulnerable, to the false promises that would inevitably collapse under the weight of reality. They'd stopped showing pictures of it, stopped mentioning it at all, as if by ignoring it, they could make it cease to exist. But she didn't look weak. Standing there in the harbor, rising from a star-shaped base that seemed itself impossibly large, dwarfed by the skyscrapers behind her, but somehow still commanding the space, she looked eternal. Her copper skin had turned green with age and weather, verdigris coating her like armor. Her torch was raised high, steady, a promise or a warning, or maybe both. Her face was calm, almost serene, gazing out toward Europe with an expression that suggested she'd seen everything humanity could offer and remained unbowed by any of it. Werner stared at her until his eyes burned, until the ship had passed and she disappeared from view behind the curve of the harbor. He tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd been taught, and found the task impossible. One of them had to be a lie. Either his teachers had lied about American weakness, or his eyes were lying about American strength. His eyes felt more trustworthy. The ship docked at Pier 92, a massive concrete structure that extended into the Hudson River like a gray finger pointing toward New Jersey. The pier itself was larger than the entire train station in Stuttgart, a testament to scale that was becoming a theme. Everything here was bigger, longer, wider, more, as if America had taken the normal dimensions of the world and decided they weren't enough. Trucks waited in neat rows, dozens of them, olive drab and identical, engines idling, ready to transport prisoners to wherever they were going next. American soldiers stood at attention, their uniforms pressed despite the June heat, their weapons clean and well-maintained, their faces young and well-fed. The contrast hit Werner like a physical blow. These men looked nothing like the desperate, starving enemy he'd been promised. They looked healthy, professional, bored even, as if processing hundreds of German prisoners was just another day's work, no more remarkable than loading cargo or directing traffic. Werner studied their faces as the prisoners were assembled on deck. Most of these guards couldn't be more than 20 years old. Farm boys and city boys, drafted into service but showing no signs that the hardship he'd been told was destroying America from within. Their cheeks were full. Their eyes were clear. Their uniforms fit properly, tailored and maintained. They carried themselves with the easy confidence of men who'd never questioned whether their next meal would come, whether their equipment would function, whether their nation could afford to keep fighting. The prisoners were assembled on deck in groups of 50, 300 men in tattered uniforms. They had been tan once, but were now closer to the color of dust. Sunburned and thin, blinking in the bright June sunlight that seemed too clear, too clean after weeks below deck. Werner stood in the third row, Dietrich beside him, both of them staring at the city that rose before them like a wall of impossible ambition. A captain stepped forward. He was older than the guards, maybe 35, with silver captain's bars catching the sunlight and an American flag patch bright on his shoulder. His face was lined but not cruel, professional but not cold. He looked like a man who'd done this hundreds of times before and would do it hundreds of times again, until every prisoner in Europe had been processed through his hands. He addressed them through an interpreter, a German-American sergeant who spoke with an accent that placed him somewhere near Frankfurt before he'd immigrated. Werner wondered if the sergeant had family back in Germany, if he'd left before the regime took power or after, if he felt any kinship with the men he was translating for, or if America had made him into something else entirely. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," the captain said, his voice carrying across the assembled prisoners with practiced authority. "You will be fed 3 meals a day. You will be clothed in clean uniforms marked with PW insignia. You will be given medical care when needed. You will be assigned to work details that comply with international law, and that work will be compensated according to established rates. 50 cents per day for manual labor, 80 cents for skilled work. He paused, letting the interpreter finish before continuing. Werner tried to process what he was hearing. They were going to be paid for their labor? Prisoners of war, defeated enemies, and they'd receive actual money for working? It seemed impossible, absurd. In North Africa, captured Allied soldiers had been put to work without compensation, treated as free labor to support the occupation. That was how war worked. Victors took everything from the defeated. That was the natural order. If you follow the rules, your time here will be bearable, the captain continued. If you cause trouble, there will be consequences. But let me be clear about something. He stepped closer, his gaze sweeping across the assembled prisoners with an intensity that demanded attention. You are in America now. The war you were told about, the war your officers described to you, that war doesn't exist. It never existed. It was propaganda, lies meant to keep you fighting for a cause that was lost before it began. He gestured at the skyline behind him. The skyscrapers rose like a wall of steel and glass, their windows reflecting the morning sun in thousands of bright points that hurt to look at directly. The city hummed with activity, even on a Sunday morning. Cars honked in the distance. Ships blew their horns. Somewhere far off, a train rattled across elevated tracks, steel wheels on steel rails, creating a rhythm that spoke of movement and industry and unstoppable momentum. What exists is what you see around you, the captain said. This is America. This is the nation you've been fighting. And I want you to understand, really understand, that you never had a chance. Not because you weren't brave soldiers. Not because you didn't fight hard. But because you were sent to fight an enemy that could build cities like this while simultaneously building the greatest military force in human history. He let that sink in. The silence was absolute. Even the city seemed to quiet, as if waiting to hear what came next. Welcome to New York, the captain said. His voice softened slightly, not quite kind, but no longer purely professional. I hope you survive to see home again. Many of you will. The war won't last much longer. And when it's over, you'll go back to whatever's left of Germany. But while you're here, you'll see things that will change how you think about the world. That's not a threat. It's just a fact. They were loaded onto trucks, canvas-covered military transports that smelled of diesel and rubber and fresh paint. The interiors were clean, the benches welded steel that had been smoothed to prevent injury. The canvas coverings knew enough that they hadn't yet faded in the sun. Even the trucks spoke of abundance, of a military that could afford to maintain its equipment, to replace what wore out, to never settle for second best. Werner sat near the back flap, one hand gripping the metal bench, the other clutching his small canvas bag of possessions. Everything he owned in the world fit in that bag, issued to him by British captors in Tunisia. One change of clothes, both shirts worn thin at the elbows. A photograph of his mother standing in her garden, taken the summer before the regime called him up, her face squinting into the sun and smiling despite everything. A letter from his sister Eva that he'd read so many times the paper was soft as cloth, the ink fading at the creases. 3 items. His entire life reduced to 3 items that weighed less than a kilogram. The truck convoy moved through Manhattan, and even though the canvas coverings blocked most of their view, Werner could see slices of the city passing by through gaps and tears in the fabric. Buildings so tall they blocked out the sun, creating canyons of shadow where crowds moved like rivers. The sidewalks were packed with people even on a Sunday morning, men in suits, women in dresses, children running ahead of parents, all of them going somewhere, doing something, living lives that seemed utterly disconnected from the reality of war. Shops lined the streets, their windows full of goods that seemed excessive even by peacetime standards. Clothing stores with mannequins wearing the latest fashions. Butcher shops with entire sides of beef hanging in windows. Bakeries with displays of breads and pastries and cakes. Bookstores, hardware stores, department stores with windows so large you could see entire floors of merchandise from the street. Everything was available. Everything was abundant. Nothing appeared rationed or restricted or limited by wartime necessity. Werner watched a restaurant pass by, its menu posted in the window, advertising steaks, chops, roast chicken, seafood, pies, puddings. 20 different dishes, maybe more, available for anyone with money to pay. In Stuttgart, restaurants had closed 2 years ago. The regime had requisitioned their supplies, redirected their resources toward the military effort. His mother's letters mentioned standing in line for hours to buy bread, using ration coupons that never stretched far enough, making soup from vegetables she grew in her garden, because meat was impossible to find. Here, people were choosing between 20 different meals, deciding whether they wanted steak or seafood, walking past restaurants because they preferred the 1-2 blocks away that had better desserts. The disconnect was staggering, incomprehensible. This was supposed to be the enemy, the nation that was losing, the people who were meant to be suffering under the weight of a war they couldn't win. But they looked like they were thriving. They looked like the war was something happening far away, to other people, in places they'd never visit. An inconvenience, perhaps, a concern, but not an existential threat, not an end to their way of life. The truck stopped at a traffic light. Werner leaned forward, peering through a gap in the canvas at eye level. A woman walked past, wearing a blue dress that looked new, carrying shopping bags from 3 different stores, her heels clicking on the pavement. She was laughing at something her companion said, her head thrown back, completely unself-conscious. Just laughing. Walking through Manhattan in June 1943 like the war was a distant concern, something happening to other people in other places. Behind her, a newsstand sold papers with headlines about Allied victories in the Pacific, about bomber campaigns over Europe, about production quotas being exceeded in factories across the nation. "They don't even know we're here," Otto muttered from across the truck. His iron cross caught a beam of light filtering through the canvas, throwing a tiny reflection onto the metal wall. They don't care. But Werner thought that might be even worse. Not that Americans didn't know about German prisoners in their city, but that they knew and simply went about their lives, shopping, working, laughing. The war hadn't touched this place. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. These people worried about which restaurant to choose, which movie to see, whether their favorite baseball team would win. They weren't hiding in bomb shelters. They weren't rationing food until children went to bed hungry. They weren't watching their cities burn. The convoy continued north, eventually leaving Manhattan and crossing into the Bronx. The buildings changed. Less steel and glass, more brick and stone. Residential neighborhoods where laundry hung from fire escapes and children played stickball. In the streets, and old men sat on stoops reading papers. Normal life, ordinary life, the kind of life that felt impossible during wartime, and yet here it was, unfolding on every block they passed. They saw a park where families were having picnics, actual picnics, with blankets spread on grass and baskets full of food. Werner watched a father toss a baseball with his son, the ball arcing through June sunlight, while the mother read a book in the shade of an enormous tree. The scene could have been from before the war, from a time when the world made sense and nations weren't locked in combat that killed millions. But it wasn't from before the war. It was happening right now, in the 3rd year of a global conflict, while that family's nation was fighting on multiple continents simultaneously. How do they do it? Dietrich whispered. He was pressed against the canvas on the other side of the truck, trying to see as much as possible through the limited openings. How do they fight a war like this and still live? Werner had no answer. He'd spent 3 years in military service, 3 years where every moment had been consumed by the war, training, deployment, combat, survival. There had been no room for anything else. No space for normal life, or ordinary pleasures, or simple joy. The war had consumed everything, demanded everything, taken everything until there was nothing left but exhaustion, and fear and the desperate hope that you might survive another day. But America was fighting the same war, fielding armies in Europe and the Pacific, building weapons in ships and planes at rates that shouldn't be possible, and still their civilians were having picnics in the park. Still their women were shopping in stores full of goods. Still their children were playing baseball in the streets. They arrived at Camp Shanks by late afternoon, a massive staging area in Orangeburg, New York, built to process troops heading overseas. But instead of American soldiers preparing for deployment, the camp now held prisoners. Thousands of them. Germans, Italians, even a few Japanese, though they were kept separate. The camp sprawled across hundreds of acres, rows of identical barracks arranged in perfect military precision, guard towers at regular intervals, wire fences marking boundaries that seemed almost casual compared to the fortified positions Werner had built in North Africa. They were processed. Names recorded. Uniforms exchanged for American-made prison clothing marked with large PW letters. Medical examinations. Delousing. The humiliation of surrendered men being inventoried like cargo. Werner stood in line for his meal that evening, metal tray in hand, and watched the servers pile food onto his plate. Mashed potatoes. Green beans. Roast beef so tender it fell apart under his fork. White bread, real butter, coffee with cream and sugar. He stared at the tray, unable to process what he was seeing. In Tunisia, they'd eaten hardtack and tinned meat when they ate at all. In the transit camp, thin soup and stale bread. Now, here, captured and defeated, he was looking at more food than he'd seen in months. "Is this a trick?" he asked the server, a young American private with red hair and freckles. The private looked confused. "Trick? The food. Is this real?" The confusion deepened. "Yeah, it's real. Standard meal. Nothing special. You should see what they serve on Sundays." He gestured with his serving spoon. "There's more if you want seconds. Just get back in line." Werner carried his tray to a table where other German prisoners sat in stunned silence, staring at their food like it might vanish if they looked away. Dietrich was already eating, methodically working through his meal with the focus of a man who hasn't trusted abundance in years. "They're feeding us better than our own officers did," someone said. No one argued. It was simply true. That night, Werner lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. The barracks were clean, the mattress thin but adequate, the blanket wool and warm. Through the window, he could see the glow of New York City on the horizon, a dome of light that pushed back the darkness. Even at night, the city hummed with energy. Lights that never went out. A city that never slept, never stopped, never questioned its own strength. He thought about those skyscrapers. About buildings so tall they seemed to touch the clouds. About a nation that could build such things while also building ships and planes and tanks faster than the regime could destroy them. About a people so confident in their victory that they fed their prisoners roast beef and offered seconds. For the first time since his capture, Werner allowed himself to think a thought that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. A thought that felt like treason, even in the privacy of his own mind. Maybe they really were going to win. Not through propaganda or superior willpower or destiny, but through simple, overwhelming capacity. Through factories that never stopped running. Through farms that never stopped producing. Through a nation that could house millions of soldiers and feed millions of prisoners, and still build buildings that touched the sky. The next morning, they were organized into work details. Groups of 50 prisoners assigned to various tasks around the camp and the surrounding area. Werner's group was sent to help construct new barracks, which seemed almost absurd. German prisoners building their own prison housing. But the work was straightforward, the supervision minimal, and the American guards treated them with a kind of bored professionalism that suggested this was just another job. During lunch break, Werner found himself talking with one of the guards, a corporal from Pennsylvania named Miller, who smoked Lucky Strikes and complained about the heat. "You boys put up much of a fight in North Africa?" Miller asked conversationally, as if discussing a baseball game rather than a battle. "We fought," Werner said carefully. His English was limited, but functional. "But your tanks, your planes?" "Too many." Miller nodded, unsurprised. "Yeah, we're good at making things. Always have been. My dad worked in a steel mill in Pittsburgh. Built the girders for the Empire State Building, actually. Said it was the biggest job he ever had." He took a drag from his cigarette. "You see the Empire State when you came in?" "Yes." Werner paused, trying to find the right words. "We thought maybe it was. Not real propaganda." Miller actually laughed at that. "Propaganda? Hell, that thing's been there since 1931. Your guy was still a corporal when we finished it." He stubbed out his cigarette on his boot heel. "The thing about America, Krause, is we're really good at two things: building stuff and breaking stuff. Right now, we're doing both." It was such a casual statement, delivered without malice or boasting, that it hit harder than any propaganda film Werner had ever seen. This wasn't a nation claiming strength. This was a nation so confident in its strength that it didn't need to claim anything. The evidence was everywhere. In the food, in the buildings, in the easy confidence of young soldiers who knew, absolutely knew, they were on the winning side. Weeks passed. The routine of camp life settled over the prisoners like a familiar coat. Work details, meals, recreation time where they could, play cards or read or write letters home that would be censored but would still reach their families. The American Red Cross visited regularly, ensuring conditions met international standards. The camp had a library, a chapel, even a small theater where they could watch movies. Werner watched it happen one night on a Tuesday evening, sitting in a room full of German prisoners, staring at a screen showing an America that seemed too perfect to be real. Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert riding buses through a Depression era. America that still looked more prosperous than present-day Germany. Happy people, full stores, roads full of cars. Even in poverty, even in hardship, the casual abundance was staggering. "It's fake," Otto insisted afterward. Hollywood illusion. But Werner wasn't so sure anymore. He'd seen New York. He'd eaten American food. He de-watched American soldiers go about their business with the kind of casual efficiency that came from working within a system that actually functioned. This wasn't illusion. This was simply America, a nation so vast and wealthy that even showing its flaws still made it look enviably strong. Summer turned to autumn. Leaves on the trees outside the camp fence changed color, putting on a show of reds and golds that reminded Werner of home. His mother's letters arrived regularly now, carefully worded to pass the censors. But he could read between the lines. Shortages, air raids, fear. Stuttgart was being bombed. The factories were being destroyed. The city he'd known was being systematically erased from the sky. Meanwhile, New York kept building. In October, some of the prisoners were transferred to work details in Manhattan, helping with construction projects and dock work. Werner was among them. They were trucked into the city 3 times a week, always under guard, always wearing their P.W.marked uniforms, but increasingly trusted with real work. He helped unload cargo ships at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, carried lumber at construction sites in Queens, swept streets in Lower Manhattan, while crowds of New Yorkers walked past without giving him a second glance. Just another worker in a city that never stopped working. One afternoon, his detail was sent to help with cleanup at a construction site near the Empire State Building. They were demolishing an old tenement to make room for something new, and the prisoners were assigned to haul away debris. Werner found himself standing at the base of the great building, craning his neck back to see where it ended and sky began. A construction foreman noticed him staring. Old man, probably in his 60s, with hands like leather and eyes that suggested he'd seen everything twice. Something, isn't it? The foreman said. Werner nodded, unable to find words. I worked on that building, the foreman continued. Was part of the crew that installed the limestone facade on the upper floors. Scared the hell out of me, being that high up, but we did it. 1 year and 45 days from start to finish. 3,000 men working in shifts. We lost 5 guys during construction. 5 levs to build the tallest building in the world. He spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Your country was building an army. We were building this. Different priorities, I guess. That night, back at camp, Werner wrote a letter to his sister. He tried to describe what he'd seen, what he'd experienced, but the words felt inadequate. How do you explain skyscrapers to someone who's never seen a building taller than 5 stories? How do you describe a nation so wealthy it feeds its prisoners better than their own army fed them? I don't think we understood what we were fighting, he wrote finally. I don't think anyone told us the truth. Winter came. Snow fell over camp shanks, covering everything in white, muffling sound, and making the camp feel isolated from the world. But even in winter, the glow of New York City remained visible on the horizon, a reminder that somewhere out there, life continued at full speed. Christmas brought unexpected gifts. The Red Cross delivered packages. American families adopted groups of prisoners, sending letters and small presents. Werner received a scarf, hand-knitted by a woman in Ohio, who signed her card, hoping for peace. The gesture made him cry in the darkness of his bunk, silent tears that he wiped away before anyone could see. Peace. What would that even look like now? Going home to a Germany that had lost everything while America had gained the world? Returning to Stuttgart to find his mother's house destroyed, his sister displaced, his city in ruins? The future felt like a vast darkness with no landmarks to guide him. Spring 1944 arrived with sudden warmth and the smell of growing things. The war news grew worse for the regime. Italy had switched sides. The Soviets were advancing from the east. And everyone knew, even the most optimistic prisoners, that an invasion of France was coming. The Americans and British were massing troops across England. The skies over Germany were full of bombers every night now. The end was approaching, visible from miles away like storm clouds on the horizon. But America kept building. New skyscrapers under construction. New ships launched from Brooklyn Navy Yard. New planes rolling out of factories at a rate that made Werner's head spin when he read the numbers in American newspapers. 3,000 planes a month. 4,000. 5,000. Numbers that shouldn't be possible. One day in May, Werner's work detail was assigned to help at a war bond rally in Times Square. They were there to move equipment, set up chairs, handle logistics, while American civilians gathered to pledge money for the war effort. Werner stood at the edge of the crowd and watched thousands of people queue to buy bonds to donate their wages to support a war effort that was costing billions of dollars and somehow still leaving enough for roast beef dinners and skyscrapers and movies. A woman approached him during a break. Middle-aged, wearing a blue dress and a hat with a small American flag pinned to it. "You're German?" she asked. Werner nodded warily. "Yes, ma'am. My son's over there," she said, "fighting in Italy. He writes letters when he can. Says you boys fight hard." She paused, studying his face. "You look young." 23, ma'am. "Same as my son." She reached into her purse and pulled out a chocolate bar, pressed it into his hand. "I don't hate you. I hope you know that. I hate this war. I hate what it's doing to all our boys. Yours and mine." She walked away before Werner could respond, disappearing into the crowd while he stood there holding American chocolate and trying to understand why an enemy would show him kindness. That night, lying in his bunk, Werner thought about those skyscrapers again. about buildings that touched the clouds, about a nation that could fight a global war and still build monuments to its own optimism, about a people who could house their enemies in clean barracks and feed them roast beef and still find room for mercy. He understood now what those buildings really were. Not secret weapons, not propaganda. They were proof of capacity, proof of will, proof that a nation that could build such things could also defeat any enemy who stood against it. The Empire State Building wasn't a weapon. It was a warning, a promise, a testament to what America could do when it decided to do something. And Werner Krause, prisoner of war, former corporal in the Wehrmacht, realized that he'd been fighting an impossible war from the very beginning. Not because German soldiers weren't brave or skilled or determined, but because they'd been sent to fight a nation that could build skyscrapers while simultaneously building the greatest military machine the world had ever seen. That thought should have filled him with despair. Instead, oddly, it brought a kind of peace. The war was lost. Everyone knew it now, even if no one said it out loud. But maybe that meant the dying could stop. Maybe that meant going home, eventually, to whatever Germany remained. Maybe that meant a future where young men didn't die in deserts and mountains and beaches for lies their leaders told them. Through the window, the glow of New York City painted the night sky orange and gold. Somewhere out there, those skyscrapers stood tall, solid, permanent, still building, still growing, still touching the clouds. Werner closed his eyes and tried to imagine a world at peace. It was hard. He'd spent 3 years at war, 3 years believing lies, 3 years fighting for something that turned out to be built on nothing but propaganda and false promises. But maybe, he thought as sleep finally came, maybe those skyscrapers pointed toward something better. Maybe a nation that could build such things could also build a peace worth having. The last thing he saw before sleep took him was that image burned into his memory. The Empire State Building rising from morning fog, its peak lost in clouds, solid and real and absolutely impossible to deny. Not a weapon, a truth. The truth that they'd been fighting against since the beginning.